Welcome to the Lonely Entrepreneur podcast series called Perspectives. I am Michael Dermer, the author and founder of The Lonely Entrepreneur. For those of you that don't know me, the Lonely Entrepreneur methodology was born from my own struggle of watching the healthcare business I built over 10 years nearly get destroyed in 10 days by the financial crisis of 2008. And it was really my change in perspective that not only allowed me to rebuild and successfully sell our business, but also propelled my company to become an industry pioneer in healthcare. In our podcast series, we will help you with the one issue we all face, the struggle, by changing your perspective on the personal and business issues we all face as entrepreneurs. We will share parts of the Lonely Entrepreneur methodology, crazy stories from our journey, and interviews with well-known entrepreneurs. We've been in the trenches and know that passion and grit is not enough. Having the right perspective helps you be a better entrepreneur and can be the difference between success and failure. To learn more about how I overcame my struggle, or about the Lonely Entrepreneur book, our coaching programs, or our free blog, visit us at lonelyentrepreneur.com. And remember, the difference between success and failure is your perspective. I hope you enjoy this episode. In this episode, I'm honored to have my cousin Ron Dermer, who probably more importantly happens to be the Israeli ambassador to the United States. You know, Ron talks about the history of Israel and how the struggle as a country for really its survival over time has led to a spirit that fuels not only the success of a nation, but also the entrepreneurial culture that exists in Israel. He also talks pretty candidly about the struggle in connection with the United States deal with Iran, and also of his own personal entrepreneurial experience. I hope you enjoy this episode. This is Michael Dermer from The Lonely Entrepreneur, and really thrilled to be here with my cousin Ron, who just by happenstance happens to be the Israeli ambassador to the United States. And thanks for joining us, Ron.
My pleasure. Great to be with you, and congratulations on a great book.
Thank you. And you know, The Lonely Entrepreneur is all about the struggle, and obviously, you know, being steeped in Israeli politics your whole life, what I really wanted to talk to you about is the Israeli entrepreneur community, and most specifically about, if you think about the history of Israel and the struggle of the country and how much has evolved. There's so many countries throughout the world that haven't done what Israel has done when it comes to entrepreneurism. How do you think that the culture and the history of Israel, just being a country that's struggled and survived and thrived in the face of so many challenges, how do you think that has led to, or has it led to, you know, the growth of the entrepreneurial spirit within Israel?
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, understand the dramatic change that has happened in the state of Israel. When Israel was founded in 1948, we had the same GDP per capita as Egypt and Jordan. Today, Israel has a higher GDP per capita than Japan, and it's greater than the average of EU countries. So we've become quite a wealthy nation. We're not a large nation. We have a small population, but GDP per capita is quite high. And we've done it while never knowing a full day of peace with all of our neighbors. We're fortunate to have made peace with Egypt in 1979, that has stood for over 3 decades, and with Jordan in 1994. But we've had to build our economy under very difficult conditions without having natural resources. The one resource that we have is our people. And it is a tremendous resource, because if you look at the numbers today, not only does Israel have high relative wealth, but in doing it without resources, what is the source of our strength? Our economic strength has really been the high-tech sector within Israel. There was a book that came out, another pretty good book called Startup Nation, a few years ago, and it laid out some of the statistics, which are pretty mind-boggling, because Israel has more companies listed on NASDAQ than any other country besides the United States and China, which is pretty impressive.
How many people live in Israel now?
8.5 million people.
Wow.
And as of a few years ago, I don't know if it's still true today, but there were more patents that Israelis had registered in the United States than Russia, China, and India combined. And there are about 2.5 billion people in Israel with its 8 million people. So but I think what's interesting, and people ask me this all the time, well, what is the secret of Israel's success?
Yeah.
And
because there's lots of countries that have 9 million people that are a speck on the on the globe when it comes to entrepreneurial development or even economic development.
So the secret ingredient, I'm going to reveal this on your program. I think it's a combination of factors. The first factor is we really have true genius in our society. I think that's spread out in many societies around the world, but we do have some pretty big brains in Israel, dealing in a lot of different industries, in agriculture, in water, in cyber, in high tech, and everything else. But the second thing that has happened really in the last 20 or 30 years is that its economy has become far more of a capitalist economy. Yeah. People forget that Israel was founded on socialism. And while I don't want to get into an argument with the founder of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, he's certainly not here to defend himself. But I would argue that Israel succeeded in its early decades despite socialism, not because of it. Now, maybe all these enemies around Israel, you needed this collectivist sort of spirit in building Israel in its early decades, but I will tell you that socialism usually does not lend itself to great innovation. Yeah. And so for the first 30 years, Israel had a largely socialist economy, even almost 40 years, and starting in the mid-1980s and accelerating in the 90s and now in the last decade. And I think a person who deserves a lot of credit for that change is the current Prime Minister of Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's been over the last 20 years either prime minister or finance minister for about 3/4 of that time. So he's helped liberalize and essentially liberate Israel's economy. So that's the second thing, genius in capitalism. But the truth is, you've got a lot of countries around the world that have genius. Yeah. You have a lot of capitalist countries in the world. Why do they not have the story of Israel's success? And this is because we have a third ingredient, which is the ultimate secret ingredient to Israel's success. And that is chutzpah. Yeah. And if your listeners don't know what chutzpah is, it's sort of gall and daring, the willingness to think outside the box, to challenge conventional wisdom.
So those are the same things that people say about entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. And I would say in Israel's case, you get all these people who come to Israel, all these representatives of different governments and business leaders who come to Israel, and they try to figure out, what's your secret? How did Israel build this high-tech ecosystem? How do you have such great innovation and great entrepreneurship? Is it in the water? Is it the climate? It's actually the culture. Yeah. And I would say to those people who are a little bit knowledgeable of the Bible, the secret's in our name. The name Israel actually was given to Jacob in the Bible. He's wrestling. If you remember, I'm going to take you back to your roots in Sunday school. Yeah. But Jacob is wrestling with an angel, and the angel says, "Release me. Day's about to break." And Jacob says, "Not before you give me a blessing." And the blessing that he gives him is he calls Jacob Israel. And the name Israel means to wrestle with God. So if Jews are going to wrestle with God, which we've been doing for about 4,000 years, then we're certainly going to wrestle with all these giants of industry. And you have this attitude that just because Apple or Microsoft or Cisco or Intel or one of these giant companies has a great idea, it does not mean that four guys in an apartment somewhere in Herzliya can't come up with a better idea. And that takes a lot of guts and chutzpah to say to yourself, I can succeed where others have failed. And I think that innovation spirit is deeply embedded in Jewish culture more generally. I mean, Jews account for 0.25% of the population, but they're about 25 or 30% of the Nobel Prizes. Yeah. How did that happen? And I'm talking about the serious Nobel Prizes, like science and chemistry and economy. Sometimes there are less serious prizes that you could win. Yeah. But in those hard sciences, they do well. And I think the reason why is not because there's just genius, because as I said, that's spread out so many civilizations and cultures. It's the willingness to take the thing that's on the blackboard that you've learned and to challenge the conventional wisdom. And I think the entrepreneur actually has to be willing to chart a course that is different than the other people who came before him, and to have the guts and the chutzpah to try. You may fail, but it's the desire to challenge, that spirit of skepticism and challenge that is deeply embedded within Israel, and I think that's what makes our economy such a remarkable success.
Well, if you look at what they're trying to do with cities and countries throughout the world to try to spur that, but in Israel, it's built on 4,000 years, right? It might be built on 4 years in Austin, Texas. right? And you've got a growing economy. But like you said, in Israel, it's so ingrained in the culture. It's not even something you have to teach, right? It's probably in the DNA of everyone.
Well, you can do certain things. First of all, is like I said before, the government needs to not screw that up, and not try to put a socialist straitjacket on what essentially is a free spirit
and it
of
sounds
innovation.
Like the Prime Minister has been a huge supporter of that for 2 decades.
A huge supporter. He's actually, for the first, I would say, capitalist prime minister in Israel's history. We've either had socialist prime ministers or statist prime ministers. We really haven't a capitalist, somebody who really believes in the market. So I think unleashing this entrepreneurial spirit within Israel over the last 20 or 30 years has created these remarkable success stories. And as I said, we have it in agriculture, in innovation. We have it in water innovation. Israel's a global power, I should say, in water. And one of these great lines I heard from our former national economic advisor, he said once that he told his American counterpart that he could take a 1,600 time longer shower than him. And that wasn't a comment on either's hygiene habits. Right. It was because Israel is number one in the world in recycling water. We recycle almost 90% of our water. Yep. And in addition to that, we developed a technology in Israel many years ago of drip irrigation, where you would plant crops a certain distance apart and drip the water on them, which, by the way, happened because you talk about an entrepreneur. Somebody was walking in a certain area in Israel and saw that there were some trees, and 2 of them were very small, and one of them was very large and lush around it. And then they looked and they saw there was a pipe that ran alongside it, and this pipe had a leak and was dripping water directly onto that tree, and that's what actually triggered the idea that you should do it. Yeah, it's a famous Israeli company that has now sold its wares all over the world, in Africa and Asia, and really have helped transform a lot of countries and drastically reduce their water intake. But Israel, as I said, is about 90% water recycling. The United States, and by comparison, is between 1% and 2%. Wow. And then we do this drip irrigation as opposed to spraying it, where you see those commercials where these huge fields and then they're spraying all that. And the second an Israeli see that, said, your guys are really wasting that water because you don't need to do that. And that our drip irrigation is 20 times more effective. So 80 times 20 is about 1,600. In addition to this will really blow you away. In cyber, which is a new industry that is interesting because it's sort of at the nexus of the security challenges that all countries around the world face, but also is a huge growing industry, and it's going to become a larger and larger share of the economy. Well, here's a statistic that will really blow you away. In 2014, Israel accounted for 10% of global investment in cybersecurity. Now, our population, is 8.5 million. That means we're 1/10 of 1% of the world's population. In 2014, we accounted for 10% of investment in cybersecurity. That means we're punching 100 times above our weight. Yep. It sounds impressive, right? Well, in 2015, the number went up to 20%. Wow. So Israel's punching 200 times above our weight. So when you think of Israel, you think, hey, this is a small country in the Middle East of 8 million people. But in cyber, Israel is China. Israel is a powerhouse. And, I think the reason why we are being successful is because we have had this ecosystem and culture that really encourages innovation. And the government, I think, can play a positive role, A, in getting out of the way, B, trying to incentivize areas that otherwise might not necessarily happen on their own, where the challenge for Israelis is to deal with the management and marketing of some of those companies. Because we have this, the trend in Israel for a long time has been to come up with a great idea, maybe in a very small team of people, to get seed capital first, then venture capital, and then ultimately to be bought up by a major company. Now, you have the last numbers that I checked is 42 out of the 50 leading technological companies in the world have R&D facilities in Israel.
Yeah.
And for some of them, it's their only R&D facility outside of the United States. And that's Apple and Microsoft and Intel and Cisco and all of these companies. And the reason why they want to be in Israel is not because they're Zionists, not because they read Herzl's The Jewish State. It's because they want access to the most dynamic, innovative people in the world.
It's interesting because when you think about what entrepreneurs deal with, right? Lack of resources, like you said before. It's not like Israel was on top of oil, didn't have natural resources like other countries in the Middle East, like Russia, right?
Well, you know what the old joke, before you get to the next point, the old joke was that Moses was a great leader, but a lousy navigator, because he took us to the one place in the Middle East where there wasn't gas and oil. Now, by the way, we have found gas in the Mediterranean, actually pretty serious reserves of gas.
Wow.
But maybe it's fortunate that we found it 60 some odd years after we built the state, because we couldn't rest on that gas, and we weren't dependent on it. And now you have this ecosystem, and I don't think it's going to ruin on our economy. On the contrary, I actually expect that if you want a tip, I would say that some of the great innovations in natural gas will come out of Israel in 5 or 10 years. Because why were we so good at water? Because we had none.
Right.
So we had to figure out a way to conserve it. Well, now they always say, necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah.
In this case, I actually think in gas, abundance is going to be the mother of invention, because we have such huge resources. No one's thought about gas and oil.
Yeah.
But right now, believe it or not, Israel will be selling gas to the Arabs.
Yep.
Who would have thought that would have happened in their lifetime? Yeah.
Well,
what was their second point?
Well, I think it's, when you think about entrepreneurs, right, the nature of the beast is I don't have resources, right? I don't have people. I don't have capital. There's all these things I don't, and yet they're asked to have this different perspective, just to go out about it and think of it in a different way. How much do you think the fact that Israel has had so much of a struggle really to survive, how much do you think that overcoming that struggle, not in an economic way, but just in a political and a geopolitical way, has led to? Do you think it's added to it, or do you think that was just so ingrained in the culture for so many years?
I definitely think it's added to it, because
we don't think about getting attacked by Mexico here in the United States, right? We don't wake up every day thinking about that, but Israel has thought that for 4,000 years, right?
Well, certainly in the modern state of Israel for 68 years, we've been thinking about it, and and Jews have had their share of enemies over the centuries as well. But I would say that there is an attitude that we need to do. I should put it this way: when Israelis hit a wall, they don't stop. And then ask somebody else, well, how are we going to resolve this problem? When you are facing serious threats with limited resources, when you hit that wall, you figure a way underneath it, around it, over it. You do everything you can in order to solve the problem, because ultimately you don't live with excuses. You just got to solve the problem. And where Israel is actually uniquely capable, and I think this is a product of probably a combination of our geopolitical circumstances, but also this culture, is cost-effective solutions for innovation. Meaning, the United States, look, there are two great centers of innovation really in the whole world. One of them is in Silicon Valley, and the second is actually in Israel. Those are the two most important centers of innovation that are producing in so many different fields huge innovations that are fundamentally transforming our world. From computer chips to if you have Waze and you use that technology that was developed in Israel, to pills that you would take that you have in your medicine cabinet. They developed that camera that you could swallow a pill and would go through your system. Medical innovation, agricultural innovation. If areas, we just had recently an Israeli company named Rewalk that figured out a way to allow paraplegics to get up and walk again. That was sort of a few years ago. It's an exoskeleton they sort of wear that they can stand. So remarkable innovations in Israel. But I think where we really stand out in Israel, as opposed to the United States, is the United States is a big ship. It's a lot to turn it around. And when it does, it's more powerful than any country in the world. But Israel's kind of like a speedboat. And we can go into an area fast and do it cheaply because we've had to do everything cheaply. And that's why when there's a natural disaster, let's say in Haiti or in Nepal, it's the Israelis that have their field clinic set up faster than anyone else and are treating patients faster than anyone else. And so I think that mindset of having to be fast, quick, and cheap to not be able to waste, I think makes us very, very good entrepreneurs.
I'll tell you a little story that I had when my company was struggling right in the middle of financial crisis. I was about to hire a CFO who was an Israeli guy, and I said, listen, you're going to walk into a little bit of a shitstorm here. And he goes, let me tell you what an 18-year-old boy does in Israel. He goes, they put you in a submarine on land with 24 other guys, and the submarine's made for about 5 people, and they pump in tear gas and puke and you stay there for a week. He goes, I think I'll be okay.
Yeah, they don't get scared off too easily, Israelis.
Well, so tell me a little bit about, obviously this, we talked a lot about it being so steeped in the culture, but you made the comment about, Israelis don't think about going up to a wall and say, oh, there's a wall. And so much about being an entrepreneur is that perspective. Tell me a little bit more. Obviously, we've seen great innovation in Israel because of that underpinning. Tell me a little bit about the military experience, right? You have so many people, explain to everybody what happens to people when they get, out of what would be high school age here and how they enter the military and what that does. And do you think that also has something to do with the spirit that's there?
I think it hones it. I think it's naturally in the culture, but probably the military hones it. And the experience for those people who don't know is that Israelis, not all Israelis, but the vast majority of Israelis go into the military.
Men and women, right?
Men and women at 18, yeah. Our women are just as tough as our men. And they go into the military at 18. They serve for somewhere between 2 and the women's slightly shorter service, maybe about 2 years, and the men closer to 3 years. And a lot of times you're serving in small units, which also lend themselves to, starting a lot of these industries afterwards. And in fact, the story of Israeli high tech is very much connected to the story of our military. And this is a fortunate consequence of the unfortunate security circumstances that we face, and making best of a difficult situation. But what happens is that the latest innovations in many fields are in the military first before they're in the commercial sector. I don't know if it's as true today as it was 20 or 30 years ago, just because the pace of development in some of these private companies is also so strong. I don't know if it's true in America, but in Israel,
I think it was true back in the same time period. I think it was true in America that if you think about all the great telecom, 20, 30 years ago, it all came from the government first.
So I think in Israel, it's still the case. And what you have are 18-year-olds, meaning our MIT is not in MIT. Our MIT is in certain units of the Israeli military. So they get access to this remarkable technology, and one of them leave and they go to some fine universities that we have in Israel, but a lot of them then start their own businesses and their own companies based on the know-how and the expertise that they've developed. And it also lends itself to Israelis having certain kind of attitude. They have a very good perspective on things. And they've dealt with much more serious stakes. So where a lot of pressure could rattle people from elsewhere, Israelis do not easily rattle, and they also understand that even if you fail, you got to pick yourself up and you got to keep moving because you've got other people who are dependent on you.
Yeah,
I think that is also something very, very powerful.
Yeah, think about, there's a reasonable chance that Israel would not have existed for many, many reasons over many, many years. So like you said, it's that perspective about it.
Yeah, well, look, we have somebody once said something to me that they another line from the Bible that famous expression, "You will live by your sword," which is actually not the big blessing that was given to Jacob. It was given to Esau by his father Isaac in the Bible. But somebody said something very interesting. To live by your sword could actually mean that when you go to the military and you develop these technologies, eventually they actually help you live. And if you actually think in the United States also, for instance, the space race. Yep. Space race not only got the United States to the moon, but it also developed a number of great technologies that have transformed your economy and have made a huge contribution. I don't know, microwaves, you name it. There were so many things that the space race helped trigger, and the science and the technology that was developed in achieving that goal had huge commercial applications. So we have a lot of those things in Israel, spin-offs from our military and people who, as I said, started in the military and all of a sudden started these hugely successful businesses.
So let me, obviously, how long have you been in your current role?
I've been ambassador for 3 years.
So tell me a little bit about, not so much in the context of entrepreneurism, but we talk a lot about the struggle with the lonely entrepreneur. In your experience, since you've been ambassador, right, you've been dealing with lots and lots of stuff going on throughout the world. What would you say has been the biggest struggle for you? And how do you think that some of the things we've been talking about have helped you?
Well, that's interesting. First of all, the name, The Lonely Entrepreneur, you know that I hate to go back to the Bible again, but it's probably my first point of reference always. But we are called the people who dwells alone. You know, the Jewish people in the Bible are called the people who dwell alone. And so sometimes when you're Israel's ambassador, you feel on certain issues that you're alone.
I'm sure.
But when you're Israel's ambassador in the United States, it's different than being Israel's ambassador anywhere else because, you know, there's no greater friend and ally to Israel than the United States. But the greatest challenge that I've had to deal with in my term has definitely been the whole struggle that we had with the United States and with the leading powers of the world over the nuclear deal with Iran.
Yep.
And Israel had a very different view than the U.S. administration did, and then the leading powers of the world had about this deal. The U.S. thought and thinks, U.S. administration, I should say, that this deal makes America and makes Israel safer. And I have no doubt about the sincerity of the president when he says that. We just think that he's mistaken. Israel believes, continues to believed in the last few years and believes today that the deal is dangerous. So in order to make our case to the American public, in order to make our case to the Congress, that was probably the most important challenge that I had. And I'm very honored that I had the opportunity to wage that struggle, because one thing I'm always mindful of as Israel's ambassador, that there was once a time where the Jewish people didn't have a voice. There was once a time, because we weren't a sovereign nation in history. You know, we have we're an old people, 4,000 years, but we did not have a sovereign state for many years. And there was a great cost to us for not having sovereignty. The cost of being a powerless people. And by power, I don't mean influence. I mean power. And power begins and doesn't end, I should say, but it begins in the foremost power is the ability to defend yourself. And that was something that was denied the Jews for a long time. And today, thankfully, in the state of Israel, we have the ability to defend ourselves. It hasn't ended hatred towards Israel or end hatred towards the Jewish people, but, you know, now we're on the battlefield, and now we have the ability to defend ourselves. But the other thing Israel gave us, another thing it gave us is a voice, the ability to make our case before the nations of the world.
Well, you know, it's on a much smaller scale, but it's like the entrepreneur that sits in their apartment, right? And they're by themselves, and they might be curing cancer or inventing plutonium, but nobody knows about it, right? And it's till they can break through, and obviously it's on a much, much smaller, less significant scale, but it's interesting that you say that.
But, you know, it is on a different scale, but, you know, when they were the first Zionists, the early Zionists, were fighting against tremendous forces, and very few people believed that it would be possible to do. When Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism in the late 19th century, had the idea that the Jewish people would restore sovereignty in their ancient homeland, many people thought he was crazy. And there were very, very few people who got on board. Very few. When this in 1896, in 1897, you had the first Zionist Congress. He wrote his book, The Jewish State, in 1896. But this was something that was widely rejected, including in the Jewish world. Very few. And just to tell you some numbers, it shows how remarkable the transformation has been. And you talk about that single entrepreneur who's sitting in his apartment somewhere, not believing his idea is possible. Well, Herzl's most famous line was, "If you will it, it is no dream." That was his most famous line. And you could probably put that on a big sign in all of these lonely entrepreneurs' home. Well, what happened? Herzl foresaw the dangers that the Jewish people faced at the time. He also planned out what he felt would be a solution to those problems, a way to address those dangers by the Jews basically restoring their sovereignty, going back to their ancestral homeland, and building the military capability to defend themselves and to take their place among the nations of the world. Well, nearly a half century after Herzl's death, the State of Israel was established in 1948. But very few people know that only a fraction of the Jews lived in Israel when Israel was established.
Yeah.
My mother, as you know, your aunt, was one of them. And in 1948, when Israel was born, there were 600,000 Jews who were there, which at the time was about 5% of the world's Jewish population.
Yep.
That's it.
Yep.
Today, 68 years later, Israel is the largest Jewish community in the world, meaning there are more Jews living in Israel than there are in any other country, including the United States. By the way, there are more Jews living in New York City than in any other city in the world, so they still hold that title, and frankly, New York also has better bagels, but I hope you don't put this out on the internet and create problems for the Israeli ambassador.
Present company included.
That's right.
New York guy, Jewish guy living in New York.
But it just goes to show you what a lonely person who has a big idea that seems crazy at the time, if they're determined enough, and I think talented enough, and if they will it, it won't be a dream, that it's possible to make it happen. And if you look at what has happened with Zionism, it's probably one of the greatest success stories ever. From a situation where so few people believed that this would be possible, but there was started with a handful, and it grew to a small group, but a determined group, and then they were able to transform Jewish history and really one of the great miracles of the 20th century, all because a few people had a great idea, and they didn't give up.
Well, if you really think about it, when the entrepreneur's sitting by themselves in their apartment, right, there's not 100 entrepreneurs around them attacking them and trying to take them down. That's Israel, right? Certainly, maybe if they make a case for their business and they go up against some of the companies you mentioned, they might feel threatened by a small entrepreneurial company that turned into places like Facebook and other places like that. But Israel actually had people that were actively preventing.
That's right. I always say to myself, people tell me all the time, you got a really, really tough job. I said, no, I don't really think I have a really tough job, because my grandparents and their grandparents, our grandparents, and their grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents, going back about 100 generations, would have given anything to trade their problems with mine. So if that lonely entrepreneur is listening in an apartment, believe me, you're not that bad off. The situation could be much worse, and they just have to grind it out to believe in themselves and to have a certain attitude. I mean, there's a hubris involved in it as well. When everyone is telling you that you're wrong, I mean, you start to doubt yourself. And that is probably the most corrosive thing at all. It's not actually what the people who don't believe say. It's when you actually start internalizing that criticism. I'll tell you something that from a different era, also from the time of the founding of the Jewish state, but maybe it's relevant to lonely entrepreneurs. So there was a early Zionist thinker named Ahad Ha'am who wrote an essay about 100 years ago, and he said the blood libel had done something very good to the Jewish people. And if your listeners don't know what a blood libel was this ancient lie where the Jews were killing Christian children and using their blood to bake matzahs on Passover. And Ahad Ha'am, real Jewish scholar and thinker, said that the blood libel had done something wonderful for the Jewish people. So you think to yourself, how can that be? How many people were killed, were dispossessed, were expelled from areas because of this lie that was very, very prominent in the Middle Ages? He said because in the Middle Ages, most people believed that the blood libel was true. Even intellectuals, not just ignorant masses, but the intellectuals. But Jews knew it was totally false. So he said it did something very good for the Jewish people. It taught them that the whole world could believe something and that the whole world was wrong. Because the most dangerous thing is when you start believing these attacks. Now, that's when you're dealing with enemies and anti-Semitism and hatred. But if there is a lesson to be learned, is just because everyone's telling you that your idea is no good, just because everyone's telling you that it has no hope and no chance, it's not true.
Well, think about Amazon, right? People said, No one's ever going to buy a book in a bookstore anymore. And think about Starbucks, where Howard Schultz said, here's what we're going to do. Even though New York City has great coffee every 5 feet, we're going to invest in real estate on every block, right? And oh, by the way, if nobody buys coffee, we're going to be stuck with all these real estate. And people at the time said, that's crazy.
Right. Well, I think if I remember correctly, I went to Wharton as an undergrad. I think if memory serves, that the paper for FedEx, who was it, Frederick Smith?
Yeah, the military guy.
Yeah, I think the paper for FedEx got a C-, if I remember correctly, where people thought you just couldn't do it. I don't know what year he wrote it. Maybe it was 1970
he was a
or something.
military logistics officer, right?
And he believed in this idea, and to get a C- or whatever it was, couldn't have been comforting to him. So he could have just said, look, this is ridiculous. All these smart people don't believe in it, so there's got to be something to it. Start doubting himself. You wouldn't have had that tremendous business that he created. So look, it might be that you'll, as an entrepreneur, that your idea won't succeed. It might not be, by the way, because it's not a good idea. It might be because it's before its time. It might be because you didn't get all that capital that you needed to do it, that you couldn't get the right people. But I actually think that if somebody believes in something and they work very hard and they don't lose that faith, they may succeed against the current, and then there'll be a spectacular success. But let's say they fail. What is the worst thing if you fail? The lessons you learn from fighting that out till the end will be invaluable to the next success. In politics, there are very few people who became successful politicians without failing. I mean, Abraham Lincoln is a very famous story, but I'm not aware of many politicians who didn't lose elections. President Clinton he won an election. I think he was the youngest governor in Arkansas history at around 28 or 30 years old. He lost his re-election. I don't think he would have lost. I don't think he would have been president of the United States had he not lost that election, because that honed him. And my experience has been with political leaders, it's probably true in life, is that you actually learn from losing. You learn from failing. So I don't think people should be afraid of the possibility of failing. And that may, in the end of the day, separate the real winners and losers in the entrepreneurs. It's not whether they failed or succeed. It's whether they're willing to, as Teddy Roosevelt, to go into the arena, to risk it all, and also to pick themselves up after they fail. If you fail and you keep going, and you keep going, and you keep going, that actually makes you a winner in my book. It's the person who never tries, because they just have filled with self-doubt. They're never going to get anywhere.
Well, we say entrepreneur's not a job, it's an identity, right? And if you really think of it as an identity, no different than a mother or a golfer, right? The mother doesn't wake up on Thursday and say, I'm not going to be a mom today. She might screw it up, right, and not be so good at it, especially first-time moms. But like you said, it becomes part of that identity along the way. When you were at Penn, when you were at Wharton, obviously you went over to Israel and got into politics and writing pretty early. Did you ever consider being an entrepreneur?
Oh, I was an entrepreneur, actually, at Wharton. I formed a company with my closest friend at college, and we started selling study aids, because what we found when I got there my freshman year, I get into a big economics class, Econ 101 or Econ 102, whatever it was. And these were huge classes. I mean, for Penn, it's about, I don't know what it is now. At my time, it was around 15,000 or 15,000 undergraduate, maybe 10,000. But you had big classes in economics and I think calculus, about 1,000 people. And then they'd have 2 midterms and they'd have a final. And the first semester that I'm in school, you want to study for the midterm. So how do you study for a midterm? Well, you obviously studied the material, but you want to look at old tests. Where are the old tests? The old tests were in the college library, and you had to go and dig them up somewhere in the stacks and sit on the tests. And then so my friend and I had an idea. I don't even remember at this point who was the guy who came up with it. But we said, hey, why don't we just gather all these tests? It didn't have answers attached to them. Hire some of the teaching assistants, and these young people who could use the money at the time, who weren't professors, to solve them. And let's take the last 3 or 4 years of tests, and we'll put it out as a study guide. Well, within 2 months, we had formed a business, we had gotten all the exams, we had hired TAs, and I think by second semester we were selling books, and it became a huge success. And it actually, for my partner, it paid for all his college loans off. He then went the Wall Street route. We both didn't end up. I guess you could say that what I do is a little bit entrepreneurial as well, but he went the Wall Street route, became a partner at Goldman Sachs, and then a partner at Credit Suisse, and now is a partner for another investment financing operation. But it was a very successful business, and we actually tried to expand it to other universities. We actually went to University of Michigan, and we started doing it there, and we had this idea that if we could do it at University of Pennsylvania, and it was so successful, and then we could do another model, another school, but for various circumstances, it didn't work out. If I could do it all over again, maybe it would have, I don't know. But they then gave us office space, my partner and I, at the Entrepreneurial Center at Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And they would actually wheel us out, my partner and I, when the trustees would show up to talk about our business. And then we started another business where we wanted to start, would be a little bit like the Where magazine, which comes out in different cities. We started another company called At Your Leisure, which we were trying to sell this to hotels in Philadelphia, to have that kind of magazine, hotels throughout Philadelphia that would cater to both business customers and tourists. And I remember how frustrating it was to go, because it was a downturn in the economy. And what year was this? This is 1990, 1991. There was a recession in the United States, and advertising budgets were cutting back. But there was nothing like this in Philadelphia. I think they may have had something in Boston. Maybe there was something, they have the Time Out. Or something like that.
In New York, in Boston.
But this is 25 years ago, and we think, hey, this could work. The hotels were very interested in it. And then we had the problem. We had to go and get the advertisers, because we got all the good hotels to agree to actually stock it. And we got pretty smart about publishing, because we were in that business with the study aid. So we figured out how to make a very good product. And it took a lot of work, and we were working out of the Entrepreneurial Center there. And I'm going around to all of these companies to convince them to advertise with us. And I knew that we would direct a lot of traffic to them. And I remember one day being very, very frustrated. And after speaking to this guy for, must have been about 45 minutes, I told him at one point, I said, let me ask you something. What is the problem? Is it that I'm saving you time or saving you money? Which is it? Because I got so frustrated. Obviously, I didn't get him to take an ad out. But the whole experience, I think, it teaches you a lot. And I think it steels you for a lot of things that you do later. So if people have the opportunity to take the entrepreneurship route, my guess is one of two things will happen. Either you will succeed, and everyone knows where that's going to go, or you're going to fail. But if you pick yourself up after failing, you're going to be better at whatever else you're going to do in the future.
Well, it's a great way to end, and I really appreciate your time. It's very insightful to hear how, the guy sitting at Starbucks by himself, or the gal sitting in her apartment, has it tough. But I think compared to the history of Israel, it's really a great perspective on it. So thanks.
Thanks. We're the lonely entrepreneurial country. But thanks, and best of luck with the book. And definitely read it. And they make wonderful Rosh Hashanah gifts and Christmas gifts and Hanukkah gifts, and especially centerpieces at weddings when you stack them up like 15 or 20 at the time. It's quite I wrote a book many years ago. I co-authored a book, and it is also a great sense of accomplishment when you finish that book, because I know how hard it is to write one. And
how old were you when you wrote your book?
It came out 10 years ago, called The Case for Democracy, The Power of Freedom to Overcome Tyranny and Terror. And I wrote it with Natan Sharansky, who was kind of like the Jewish Sakharov, was in prison for 9 years in the Soviet Gulag. And it was a great story about the book, but I know the sense of satisfaction that you must have also in writing this book and in seeing this baby that you produce, kind of like a little company, on a shelf somewhere. And hopefully your readers will glean some insight from that book, and that can help them in their lonely struggle to succeed.
Thanks a lot, Ron. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Perspectives. the podcast series from The Lonely Entrepreneur. You can find this episode and the show notes at lonelyentrepreneur.com/podcasts/Ron Dermer or at lonelyentrepreneur.com in the menu section entitled Podcasts. Our goal is that each time you interact with The Lonely Entrepreneur, you gain a perspective that helps you become a better entrepreneur when you go back to your desk that day. To do that, we provide a series of tools at lonelyentrepreneur.com. You can sign up for our free blog and receive 10 key perspectives and a daily perspective of the day. The Lonely Entrepreneur book is available at lonelyentrepreneur.com and on Amazon. And for those of you interested in our coaching programs, we offer a series of programs ranging from do-it-yourself programs to one-on-one coaching. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the difference between success and failure is your perspective.